Act 1 of Macbeth is probably the most misunderstood act of the entire play. Most students remember the witches, Lady Macbeth, the murder plot, but they often miss how carefully Shakespeare builds everything. The major themes, conflict, tragedy, it all starts right here. Before we start, remember that Macbeth doesn't begin with murder, it begins with a hero. Act 1 is essentially the story of how Shakespeare takes one of Scotland's greatest warriors and slowly places him on the path towards destruction. If we zoom right out, Act 1 is actually very simple. Macbeth meets the witches, he hears a prophecy, his ambition begins to grow, Lady Macbeth pushes him further, King Duncan arrives, and by the end of the act, Macbeth has agreed to commit murder. That's essentially the journey of Act 1. Macbeth begins in a storm. Not a castle, no kings, no Macbeth, but 3 witches. Straight away, Shakespeare creates an unsettling atmosphere. The witches decide they will meet Macbeth after the battle. Then, they say one of their most famous lines within the play. Fair is foul and foul is fair. In simple terms, things are not what they seem. Good may look bad, bad may look good, and this idea becomes incredibly important throughout the play. Scene 2. We now move to the battlefield. A wounded captain arrives to tell King Duncan about Macbeth's bravery. This is actually our first introduction to Macbeth, and it's important because Shakespeare wants us to see Macbeth as a hero before anything goes wrong. The captain calls him Brave Macbeth, and students often forget this. Macbeth isn't introduced as the villain, he's introduced as someone who is admirable. Duncan is so impressed, Macbeth's loyalty is rewarded. This previous Thane of Cawdor is executed for treason, and Macbeth receives the title. This might seem like a small moment, but actually it's huge, because the witches predict this title only moments earlier. Suddenly, the prophecy starts to become real. And what's very important to remember here is this is happening without Macbeth's knowledge. He does not know that the title of Thane of Cawdor is going to be made available. Scene 3. Now we're at one of the most important scenes of the entire play. Macbeth and Banquo, after the battle, meet the witches. The witches greet Macbeth with 3 titles: Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor, and All Hail Macbeth, thou shalt be king hereafter. The first title is already true. Macbeth is already the Thane of Glamis. The second is about to become true. A messenger is about to find Macbeth and let him know the king is bestowing that title onto Macbeth. And that's what makes the third prophecy so dangerous, and what makes Macbeth immediately start wondering if he could become king. What's really interesting is that during scene 3, Banquo hears a prophecy too, and Banquo is one of Macbeth's most loyal friends. And he reacts completely different to this prophecy. Macbeth becomes fascinated by what they say. However, Banquo is cautious. He warns Macbeth that evil forces often tell small truths to trick people into bigger problems later. This is why Banquo is so important. He proves that Macbeth has a choice. Just as Macbeth starts imagining becoming king, Duncan announces that his son Malcolm will inherit the throne. Suddenly, Macbeth has a problem. The crown isn't simply going to appear on his head. Someone now is standing in the way. And Shakespeare is planting the first real obstacle between Macbeth and power. Stars, hide your fires. Let not light see my black and deep desires. This quote is a massive warning sign from Macbeth. Right here, stars, hide your fires. In other words, don't let anyone see what I'm thinking. Macbeth is already trying to hide his ambition. It's important because back then people believed that the stars could tell people the truth, that stars could give people insight into the future. What's really also important is that he knows, therefore, that those thoughts that he's having right now are wrong. And that's what makes him tragic. He understands the difference between right and wrong. Scene 5, we meet Lady Macbeth. Macbeth sends her a letter explaining everything that has happened. The moment she reads it, she starts analysing her husband and comes to quite a big conclusion. Yes, he's ambitious, but he isn't ruthless enough. This is what she means when she says he's too full of the milk of human kindness. She thinks he's too good to do what needs to be done. Unsex me here. During scene 5, Lady Macbeth uses one of the most famous speeches in the entire play. She calls upon spirits. Any spirits. Good spirits, bad spirits, any of them. Whoever will hear her. And asks them to fill her with cruelty. This would have shocked a Shakespearean audience. Not only because of the supernatural language, but because Lady Macbeth is actively rejecting qualities society expects women to possess. The femininity, the nurturing, the care, the gentle woman is asking to be cruel. During scene 5, Lady Macbeth now starts planning independently on her own. And she tells Macbeth, look like the innocent flower, but be the serpent under. This is Shakespeare's theme of appearance versus reality in one sentence. Pretend to be loyal. Pretend to be king. Pretend to be harmless. But secretly prepare for murder. Scene 6, Duncan arrives at Inverness. And this scene is painful because the audience knows something that Duncan doesn't. He praises the castle. He talks about how welcoming everybody has made it feel. Meanwhile, we know he is walking into a trap. And this is called dramatic irony, when the audience knows something that a character on stage does not. And Shakespeare uses it here brilliantly. Act 7. This scene is also incredibly important. Macbeth finally stops and thinks. He lists reasons after reasons why Duncan shouldn't be murdered. He's his king, his relative, his guest, his friend. This is proof that Macbeth understands exactly how wrong murder would be. And this scene proves Macbeth is not naturally evil. He has a conscience and he has a moral compass. And something remarkable happens in this scene. Macbeth changes his mind. He says, we will proceed no further in this business. At this moment, Macbeth has decided not to commit murder. And students often overlook this. But it's one of the strongest pieces of evidence that Macbeth is not inherently evil. Lady Macbeth refuses to accept his decision. Instead, she attacks his masculinity, his courage, his identity. She basically says, if you were really a man, you would do it. And for a famous warrior like Macbeth, this is an incredibly powerful form of manipulation. Eventually, Macbeth gives in. He says, I am settled. This is the moment everything changes. No murder has happened yet, but the decision has been made. And once Macbeth crosses this line, there's no going back. Look at how much both characters have already changed. Macbeth starts as a respected hero, and by the end of the act, he's agreed to murder the king. Lady Macbeth starts as an ambitious wife. By the end of the act, she becomes the driving force behind the entire plot. Both characters have already begun their downfall. If you're revising, these are the quotations I would prioritise first, not because they're only important, but because they unlock multiple themes. I would recommend that you take a look at them, try and learn some of them, understand them, know where they come from in the story, and you'll have a strong foundation for most Macbeth essays. So if I had to summarise Act 1 in one sentence, it would be this. A heroic soldier hears a prophecy, begins to desire power, and is manipulated into agreeing to murder his king. That's Act 1. The temptation, the plan, the decision. But in Act 2, Shakespeare delivers the consequences. A dagger appears, murder happens, and Macbeth begins to discover that getting what he wants comes at a terrible cost. I'll see you in Act 2.